And share. Okay, so let's get through the last of this material. I think we got to this slide, to the electroencephalogram, on Wednesday. So this last part of this chapter, at first I'm going to talk a little bit about some integrative functions of the brain, so where different parts of the brain work together to kind of give us some overall functionality, and then get into the cranial nerves, which is the last part of this chapter. So yeah, electroencephalogram, the EEG, this basically just looks at how much electrical activity is happening in a person's brain. So you can look at different parts of the brain based on, I guess, what is of worry to a doctor. If there's something wrong potentially with the frontal lobe or the occipital lobe, they can basically measure the brain waves using an EEG to see if there's activity or not enough activity, too much activity, etc. It can diagnose degenerative brain diseases, so Alzheimer's, dementia, that kind of stuff can be diagnosed using an EEG. Metabolic abnormalities, so if there's some kind of, if your brain isn't using glucose appropriately or something, that will show up in the electrical waves a lot of times, brain tumors, anything that's kind of blocking those electrical signals in the brain. Okay. I'm going to talk for a few slides here about sleep, emotion, and then some of the special senses like vision, hearing, that kind of stuff, and sort of where in the brain or kind of how these different aspects of our brain work. So these are the integrative functions, where there's different parts of our brain that are controlling these obviously really important functions of our body. So first, sleep. Has everyone heard of circadian rhythms? I think everyone's at least heard that term. So that's like a 24-hour cycle of rhythm that occurs where you're awake for a certain portion and then you're asleep for a certain portion. And it's pretty much based on more or less daylight. So we're supposed to sleep at certain times and supposed to be awake at certain times. When you go to sleep, you go into something called sleep paralysis. So your muscles are actually almost paralyzed. There's not much movement. There might be a little bit of jerking, but for the most part, your muscles are inactive, which is a good thing when you're sleeping. We generally have 4 different stages of sleep, from really almost not asleep, so you can be drowsy and still in the stage 1 of sleep, all the way down to really, really deep sleep where it's hard to wake somebody up. So stage 1 is where you might be kind of going in and out of sleep, or if you jerk really quickly and wake yourself up, that's kind of that stage 1 sleep stage where you're easily awakened. Stage 2 is light sleep, not a whole lot of detail there. And then we get into the deeper realms of sleep in stage 3 and 4. Stage 3, you get into that deep, moderate to deep sleep. Muscles relax a lot more and your vital signs actually drop. So your heart rate drops. A lot of times your temperature, your body temperature will drop. Your blood pressure goes down. And then when you get into stage 4, all of that happens, but just even more so. So your muscles are more relaxed, more sleep paralysis. The vitals are very low and it's hard to wake someone up from that stage 4 deep, deep sleep. We go through these stages, kind of stage 1 down to stage 4, but then we'll backtrack a little bit as we're asleep. So back from stage 4, we'll kind of backtrack into stage 2 or 3 about 5 times a night. So that's when you undergo what's called rapid eye movement or REM sleep, which I think most people have heard of. If you look at someone sleeping, you'll see their eyes moving back and forth under their eyelids. Hopefully their eyes aren't open, but their eyes are closed, and then there's a lot of eye movement. So this is when you typically have those dreams that you can remember that are really vivid and long. That occurs during this REM sleep where you're backtracking out of that really deep sleep and back into some kind of lighter sleep. Sleep is really important. It can actually be deadly if you don't sleep, at least based on experiments in lab animals. It depends on the amount, but your body needs sleep in order to recover. Your brain needs a lot of ATP, which means it takes a lot of glycogen or glucose to power that ATP production, so giving your body a break from that is really important. REM sleep can actually help consolidate and strengthen the synapses in your brain, so the communication between different neurons can be strengthened with REM sleep. And then also, I think if you guys were there for, well, you hopefully watched the video at least, the Alzheimer's group showed that sleep is really important to avoid dementia and potentially Alzheimer's, because it helps to strengthen these synapses. So I know this is probably falling on deaf ears as college students, but sleep is really important. So the more sleep you get, the better sleep you get, the more effectively your brain will function. So you'll be able to study better, remember things better. I always tell students not to pull all-nighters. I know it's really tempting, but if you pull an all-nighter, you're not reinforcing the synapses for the information you just learned, right? So if you say study until 9 or 10 at night and then get a good night's sleep, all that information that you learn kind of cements itself in your brain a lot better versus if you stay up all night. So at the very least, get a good night of sleep, maybe wake up early, like 5 or 6. Study for the hard exam that you have that day, but try to get some good sleep. It really helps to cement that information so it's easier to recall it on the exam. Again, I know it might be falling on deaf ears, but that's what the research says. Okay, so that's sleep. I want to briefly talk about emotion. There's obviously a lot that goes into emotion. There's psychology classes you can take that talk about emotion and abnormal psychology where emotions kind of go awry, but I don't really have time to get into all that in AMP. It's fascinating, but I'm just going to focus on some of the more kind of superficial information about emotion. Emotional feelings and then the expressions of those emotions are basically controlled in the prefrontal cortex and then the diencephalon of the brain. So we've talked about the diencephalon. That includes the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the epithalamus, kind of right in the middle of the head. The prefrontal cortex is basically the very front of the brain. So right below your forehead or just deep to your forehead is going to be the prefrontal cortex of the cerebrum. This is where you make all of your judgments from, where you control the expression of your emotions. So if you've ever known a child, they are not good at controlling their emotions, right? My 2-year-old will flip out if I take away his toy. Sometimes he won't. That's because his prefrontal cortex is not well developed. So young kids up until teenage years don't have a well-developed prefrontal cortex, so they can't really control their emotions. They just all come out. Hopefully by the time you're an adult, that doesn't happen and you're not rolling around on the floor kicking and screaming if someone takes something from you. That indicates your prefrontal cortex is well developed, which is a good thing. So yeah, prefrontal cortex development is really important, and a lot of that, not being able to control your emotions, there's a lot in abnormal psychology, if they still call it that, about that control of emotions. It's pretty fascinating, but that's kind of the basics of it. Okay, and then feelings like fear, happiness, sadness, all those wonderful feelings generally arise from part of the diencephalon, so the hypothalamus, which is going to be right down here. And then something we haven't talked about, the amygdala. I'm not really going to go into a whole lot of detail about that, but the hypothalamus and the amygdala are kind of the seat of all of the feelings that you have. Not necessarily the expression, just those feelings and when you kind of experience them. All right, so yeah, like I said, just the basics of emotion, where it's controlled, that kind of stuff. Next, the special senses. The special senses are specifically vision, taste and smell, and hearing for our purposes. So these are really important senses to our survival in the world. So we kind of separate them out from a lot of the other senses that we've talked about. They're mostly limited to the head, and they employ really fairly complex sense organs. The eyes are really complex, ears are pretty complex, the nose, mouth combination can be really complex as well. The lobes that I have mentioned here under each of these special senses, so occipital, temporal, parietal, and then frontal, those are parts of the cerebrum. So the cerebrum, as I mentioned, I showed you that diagram that had the functions of there's 5 lobes in the cerebrum, and I said you don't need to know about all of the functions of all of these lobes. These are the only lobes I want you to be familiar with as they relate to the senses. So I had mentioned the occipital lobe, so the back of your head, the lobe in the back of your head deals a lot with vision. So I want you to be familiar with the lobes from these sense perspectives. Beyond that, like I said, don't worry about it. But vision is primarily controlled by the occipital lobe at the back of the head. These lobes are named based on the bones that they're under. So if you remember the skull bones, you're doing good. Occipital lobe is at the back of the head, and then part of the temporal lobe also. The temporal lobe is on the side of the head, basically where the ears are. That part of the brain is going to control you remembering things. So familiar objects and familiar people. That information will be processed in the temporal lobe. Visual information, I should say. Hearing is mostly controlled by the temporal lobe, which makes sense because that's where your ears are. And taste and smell are closely related to each other, so we kind of group them together. Gustatory or taste signals are processed by the parietal lobe, which is the parietal bones are the main bones on the sides of your head. So parietal lobes are under there. And then any olfactory signals are processed by the temporal lobes, as well as the frontal lobe, so in the front of your head. So if one of these lobes, say the temporal lobe controls or has a part in all of these, if your temporal lobe is damaged, you might not be able to hear, or maybe you can't smell things correctly, or maybe you can't see things correctly. So depending on what part of the temporal lobe is damaged, these special senses might be really significantly affected, or maybe, just minor. If only the occipital lobe is impacted, maybe just your vision would be impacted. And then just a little about language, since language is obviously so important to our society. There's 2 areas on the left side of your head that are really important in understanding language and being able to basically talk and write. So express language. They're both in the left hemisphere of the cerebrum. One is Broca's area, which is kind of up front. And the other is Wernicke's area, which I probably pronounced that wrong, but Wernicke, towards the back, but both on the left side of the head. The Wernicke area is sort of taking in the information. So it's recognizing written language and spoken language and processing that information to understand what it means. The actual act of talking or signing with your hands or writing is carried out by the other part, Broca's area. So the information, the Wernicke area will take in information and then send information to Broca's area to actually allow for the expression of anything that that person wants to say. So Broca's area controls muscles for the larynx, which is your voice box, tongue, cheeks, lips, hands for signing. If something happens to the left side of your head and the left side of your brain is impacted, one or both of these might be impacted, and you might not be able to speak, or maybe you won't be able to understand language, etc. But if only Broca's area is impacted, you wouldn't be able to speak or sign potentially, so you wouldn't be able to actually express what you want to say. But if Wernicke's area is still fine, you can understand what people are saying. You just can't respond back to them. All right, so those are the 2 really important areas involved in language skills. All right, and then that brings us to the very last section of this chapter, the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves, I think I mentioned this last Wednesday, different, medical schools, health sciences programs They want you to know the cranial nerves. There's 12 of them. They're really important. They control a lot of and sense a lot of what's happening in the head and neck area. And here we go over them based on, well, I want you to know their names, numbers, and then their functions, just because it may come up on, you know, a nursing exam or something like that you need to take in the future, but these are particularly important because there's a lot that goes on in our head and our face. So there's 12 of these, 12 pairs of these cranial nerves. They are going to basically exit the skull through all of those little holes you had to learn, all the foramina. And then they'll lead to muscles elsewhere in the head and neck, or some of them actually lead beyond down into the torso. But mostly head and neck is what they're controlling and then taking in information from. You'll see this diagram in lab this week as well, because we're doing cranial anatomy and cranial nerves in lab. So this is a view of the brain from underneath. So if you grabbed someone's brain and flipped it over and we're looking at it from on the underneath side, that's what this is. You'll see something really similar in your lab manual. The nerves are coming off of the underside of the brain. So these are obviously all cut off, but this is where they originate from. So in this diagram, it separates out the 12 cranial nerves based on whether they're sensory. So some are only sensory, they only take in information. Some are only motor, which would be the orange ones. So they only send out information, telling muscles to do things. And then the rest of them are mixed. So they'll do a little bit of sensory and a little bit of motor functionality. So those colors are shown on the left side. Remember, these are paired. The right side, they don't have them colored. They're just all purple, and they just have them labeled by number and name. All right, so in lecture, I'm not going to have you look at this diagram and pick out which nerve is which, like, oh, this is the trigeminal, this is the olfactory. In lab, I will. So in lab, you'll need to know the locations on the underside of the brain. In lecture in here, I mostly want you to know the names, numbers, and functions. We'll focus on that in here, and then the location in lab. Okay. So yeah, like I said, some cranial nerves are classified as motor, some are sensory, others are mixed. Here are the sensory nerves, 1, 2, and 8. Motor, 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12. And then mixed are basically all the rest. Interestingly, with the mixed nerves, the sensory and the motor functions don't necessarily always match up. It's not like the same senses or the same parts of the face or neck are affected from a sensory and a motor perspective with the same nerve. They sometimes seem completely unrelated. So you want to know which are sensory, motor, and mixed. And as far as functionality, this is, I know this looks really weird, but this diagram might be helpful in remembering what the functions are generally the part of the head and neck these different nerves are controlling. So I have this on each of the slides. We're going to go through each of the nerves one at a time, 1 through 12. But this refers to the functions. So 8, you can see here, it's like the ears. So this is generally a head or a face. So 8, cranial nerve 8 deals with hearing and equilibrium. So it's located there. Cranial nerve 10 controls a lot of stuff into the torso. So it's listed down here. 12 deals with the tongue. 9 deals with a lot of kind of mouth and tongue functions as well. If this is helpful, great. If it's not, you can ignore it. For me, having a visual of these different numbers can be sort of helpful in remembering what the heck these different nerves actually control or the senses that they are associated with. All right, so let's get into the nerves. Cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve. This is only sensory. This is probably the easiest nerve. It's the only one really that deals with smell. And this is the one that controls essentially our entire sense of smell. So you can see where it's located here, kind of just above the nose. So a sense or a smell will come in, it'll be sent here and processed elsewhere in the brain. So olfactory nerve, number one, sensory only, sense of smell.
Is this what determines what we like and what we don't like in senses of smell?
I think that would be more kind of higher processing in the brain, what you like and don't like. Yeah. I don't know that nerves actually determine that, but they'll take that information to the part of the brain that determines it. Oh yeah, sorry. I shouldn't have animated that, but here's, if we look at one deals with the nose. So it's located right in the middle of the face. Olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number one. Number two is the optic nerve. Also pretty easy to remember. It's only sensory and it deals with vision. Okay, so 1 and 2 are very easy to remember and pretty easy to understand. You can see number 2 here where the eyes are. It's only sensory. There's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of nerves that deal with the eyes. This is the easiest of them. I should say several, not a lot. There's several nerves that deal with the eyes. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. So that's a pretty easy, pretty straightforward name. It's a motor nerve that deals with the eyes. So it deals with the movement of the eyeball as well as the eyelid. And then it also affects the size of the pupil. So if you're in a dark area, your pupil will dilate. If you're in really bright sunlight, your pupil will constrict. That's controlled by the oculomotor nerve. So you can see on this diagram, there's a bunch of numbers around the eyes. So that should tell you there's a lot of nerves that kind of deal with the eyes. The 3 kind of being, I guess, the eyelid, sort of. So it controls the movement of the eyelid. So this is a completely motor, this has complete motor functionality, no sensory. Trochlear. Now we're getting into some weirder words that aren't as obvious. The trochlear nerve is number 4. Again, just motor function, but it also directs the movement of the eyelid. So trochlear as well as the oculomotor is controlling the eyelid. Okay, number 5, the trigeminal nerve. This is the largest cranial nerve. You can see how it branches out into a lot of different areas of the face. It's a mixed nerve, so this is the first mixed one we've gotten to. It has sensory functions for kind of the skin of the face, skin and muscles of the face. And then it also, from a motor perspective, controls the muscles that are involved in chewing. Trigeminal nerve, number 5. Oh, do I have? Yeah, there it is. There's a diagram. 5 is over the entire face because it controls aspects of sensing in the face. Next, we have the abducens nerve, which is number 6. More with the eye. So this directs movements of the eyeball, just motor function, no sensory. No eyelid control, just the eyeball. So here we have 6. That's going to be pretty much the last eye associated nerve that we have. Okay, abducens. Facial nerve, number 7. It's pretty generic sounding, but it has a motor. It has motor and sensory functions. So from a motor perspective, it allows for facial expressions. So when you're surprised or you're angry or happy. your facial nerve is controlling all of those muscles that allow for the facial expressions. And then also it controls tear, salivary, and nasal glands. From a sensory perspective, it controls the front 2/3 of your tongue. So if you're tasting something that's on the front 2/3 of your tongue, that's going to be controlled by the facial nerve. Another nerve will control or pick up senses from the posterior third of your tongue, but this is the kind of the anterior part of the tongue that it's picking up taste information from. So facial nerve 7, you can see the 7s basically make the head here on the outside of the diagram because it controls a lot of the motor function of the face. Facial muscles, sorry. And then the vestibulocochlear nerve. That's a mouthful. This is number 8. It deals with essentially the ear. So the inner ear, hearing and equilibrium. It's sensory only. So it doesn't have any motor function, but you can see it on the diagram here. The 8's making up the little ears on the head. So the ear, like I've talked about before, yes, it obviously allows you to hear things, but it also plays a huge part in your balance and your equilibrium. If your pressure's off in your inner ear, you might easily get off balance. So vestibulocochlear nerve affects that. Yeah.
When you get a cochlear implant, does that replace the nerve or just connect it to
I think that's for hearing, right?
I don't sure since that's all the nerve.
I don't know if that's a good question. I don't know. I'll have to look it up. I don't know what it connects to. All right, number 9, we're getting there. The glossopharyngeal nerve, another long one. This is motor and sensory. So glosso typically refers to like tongue, pharyngeal, the pharynx, which is, I don't think I've mentioned the pharynx before, but haven't really defined it. It's the area that sort of connects the nose and mouth to your esophagus. Your esophagus is what takes food down to your stomach. So it's involved in eating, essentially. So from a motor standpoint, this nerve is going to direct pharyngeal muscles and salivary glands. So it's really important when you're eating to have enough saliva and to be able to swallow. So glossopharyngeal nerve is really important in that. And then sensory, this is the nerve that controls the posterior third of the tongue, or picks up information from the posterior third of the tongue when it comes to taste.
It says that the implants bypass damaged portions of the ear and directly stimulate the auditory nerve.
So it stimulates the auditory nerve. Okay, interesting.
So it doesn't really replace it.
Right.
It's bypass it.
Oh, interesting. Okay, cool. Good to know. Yeah, thanks for looking that up. Oh, whoops. Sorry, I keep forgetting to bring this guy up. So number 9, kind of in the mouth area, a lot of different aspects of the mouth. So we have the number 9 there. There. Number 10, that's our next, that's our, oh, whoops. Okay, good. The larger nerve, do I have enough? Okay, good. The one that actually reaches beyond the head. So the vagus nerve, number 10, has functions that go down into the torso. So it has the most extensive distribution of all the cranial nerves. It has motor and sensory functions. The really large motor and sensory functions are going to actually deal with control of cardiac and pulmonary systems, as well as digestive and urinary systems. So kind of crazy to think about a nerve in the head actually controlling digestive and urinary systems way down in the lower torso. In the head specifically, it has motor and sensory functions, again, when it comes to swallowing So eating as well as speech. So the pharynx and the larynx are controlled in a lot of ways by the vagus nerve. Here's a nice diagram kind of showing how far down it reaches and all of the different organs that it connects to, whether it's sensory or motor functionality that it's either picking up information or sending information out to. So the vagus nerve, not spelled like Las Vegas, but V-A-G-U-S, the vagus nerve, affects a lot of different aspects of our bodies. More than you would expect. Okay, number 11, two more. The accessory nerve, this is the first one. We've talked about this really on the back side of the head. Only motor functions, and it deals with movement of the sternocleidomastoid muscles and the trapezius muscles. So neck muscle as well as that trapezius muscle, which is the big one, kind of on the upper part of the shoulder, reaches down into the upper back. That is the accessory nerve. Oh. So there you can see number 11 kind of representing shoulder area. It's affecting the shoulder muscles. You guys on Zoom, there's 11. All right, and the last one, number 12. The hypoglossal nerve. Hypoglossal means below the tongue. So the hypoglossal nerve comes up to the underside of the tongue and controls the tongue, the motor aspects of the tongue. So no sensory function here, just motor. The hypoglossal nerve, number 12. Which you can see here has a little tongue on this face diagram. Number 12. All right, so those are just 12 nerves you need to memorize. The numbers, if you're not really good with Roman numerals, start studying them. There's only 12 of them that you need to know, but that's how they're numbered, by Roman numerals. The names and then the functions. But that wraps up the cranial nerves, and that wraps up basically that entire chapter. So all of chapter 14. There's a crash course kind of recap video of the central nervous system, mostly the brain, I guess, yeah, not so much the spinal cord, but a brain recap video. So we're gonna watch that now. Yeah, and then that'll be it for the day. So hopefully this is a good review for you. Let me stop sharing with you guys on Zoom so you can see this. And I'll post this link to Zoom as well. Oh, I think I already have it pulled up. Some of this stuff you don't need to know. I'll try to fast forward through it, but he talks about the like the developmental aspects from fetus to adult of the brain, which we didn't really go into, so. Oh, come on. The sound was working this morning. Why does it never work in here? Give me a second. Oh, there we go.
Hemisphere of his brain called broke.
All right.
James was a healthy professional, a father of two. He had lots of friends, loved telling jokes, and played softball on Sundays. And one day, at the age of 45, he suffered a stroke. He bounced back fairly quickly, with one major exception. He was no longer able to speak. The stroke damaged a specific area in the left hemisphere of his brain called Broca's area and left him with what's known as Broca's aphasia. Broca's area is partly responsible for the ability to produce and process language, and Broca's aphasia often leaves its sufferers with some ability to understand speech, but an inability to produce intelligible words. James could understand his wife when she asked if he wanted cereal for breakfast, but he could only respond by repeating the word "to," although he could still intonate as though he were speaking the whole sentence. Then, after some time in therapy, something rather unexpected happened. James regained some ability to communicate through singing. Broca's aphasia can sometimes be treated by teaching patients to sing, because singing uses a different region of the brain, one that's on the right side and that's analogous to Broca's area on the left. So after some practice, James could sing words, and he eventually relearned how to talk by teaching the right side of his brain to speak rather than sing. Whether it's a stroke affecting your speech, a tumor destroying your memory, a concussion affecting your aggression, or that fateful iron rod that shot straight through Phineas Gage's skull, a lot of what we know about how the brain works has come through studying injuries to it. And what we've learned so far is that even though it looks like a 1.4 kilogram lump of gray congealed oatmeal, the brain is made up of super specific areas that have super specific functions. You might actually say the same thing about your brain that's sometimes said about politics. Everything is local. You'll remember that our nervous system is divided into two main networks that work in harmony. The central nervous system, consisting of your amazing brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, made up of the nerves coming out of that central nervous system. The central nervous system's main game is integrating the sensory information that the peripheral system collects from all over the body and responding to it by coordinating both conscious and unconscious activity. The sun is bright, so I'll shade my eyes. I'm hungry, so I'm calling the pizza man. The phone is ringing, maybe I'll answer it. All these sensations, thoughts, and directions processed through this two-part system. It's the brain, of course, that sorts out all that sensory information and gives orders. It also carries out your most complex functions, like thinking and feeling and remembering. Meanwhile, your spinal cord conducts two-way signals between your brain and the rest of your body, while also governing basic muscle reflexes and patterns that don't need your brain's blessing to work. This is how a chicken can still run around even if the poor thing has been decapitated. Both your spinal cord and brain are made of fragile, jelly-like nervous tissue that is extremely susceptible to injury. So all that goo is well protected by the bones of your vertebrae and cranium, as well as membrane layers or meninges, before being bathed in a cushy waterbed of clear cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid actually allows your brain to float somewhat in your skull, reducing its weight and letting it slosh around while you and your head are free to move. But even with all that extra protection, your brain is still vulnerable, and one thing that James's story taught us is that its vulnerabilities can be incredibly specific, because your brain is divided into specialized regions that may or may not interact with each other to produce a given action. We can better understand this division of labor by looking at how the brain first develops into its main component parts. Inside a developing embryo, the central nervous system starts off as a humble...
All right, so this is stuff you don't need to know. Lots of new terminology that I am not asking you to know. So we're going to fast forward. Maybe to here? Sure.
Cerebral hemispheres. But in order to go from a simple tube into that classic wrinkly icon we think of as the brain, each of these 5 vesicles grows in different ways. Basically, some develop a lot more than others. The least dramatic changes occur in the 3 most caudal or lower sections: the mesencephalon, the metencephalon, and the myelencephalon. They go on to form the cerebellum, which mostly helps coordinate muscular activity, and the brainstem, which plays a vital role in relaying information between the body and the higher regions of the brain. The brainstem actually has 3 main components, and I know this is going to be a lot of vocabulary here. You have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Together, they regulate many of the most basic vital involuntary functions, like keeping your heart on pace, keeping your lungs working, and controlling things like sleep, appetite, pain sensitivity, and awareness. But of the 3 brainstem parts, it's your midbrain that carries out the higher level functions. Like when your eyes track a fast moving object, or when you look behind you after hearing some sudden loud sound, it's the midbrain that receives and processes that sensory information and sends out the reflexive motor signals so you react without thinking. The midbrain also passes that data to regions like the cerebral cortex, which do the actual conscious thinking about the stimuli, like, what is that thing whizzing across the sky, or what just exploded behind me? So with the brainstem and the cerebellum covering your basic life and motor functions, you start to see somewhat more complex tasks being carried out in the next major brain structure, the diencephalon. This is where you find the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, and the mammillary bodies, which regulate things like homeostasis, alertness, and reproductive activity. Here we also find part of the limbic system, which is a center for strong emotions, like fear. This area is sometimes called the reptilian brain because we share it with some of our less philosophical animal brethren like lizards and fish. I'm not putting these guys down, but by our standards, they don't think so much as focus on the more instinctual pursuits that are ruled by the caudal regions of the brain: eat, drink, sleep, mate, stay safe. All those things are awesome, but it wasn't until the appearance of birds and mammals that some animals' brains came to be dominated by the last of the five vesicles, the telencephalon. During your brain's growth, the telencephalon undergoes the biggest changes of all as it develops into the most brainy part of your brain. The two classic walnut-looking hemispheres we collectively call the cerebrum that cover the rest of your brain like a mushroom cap on its stalk. That's the cerebrum, not to be confused with Cerebro, which is Professor X's telepathy-enhancing device, and it is the largest region of the brain and performs the highest functions. It's made up of the wrinkled outer layer of gray matter called the cerebral cortex and the inner squishy layer of white matter beneath it. And it's the cerebrum that rules our voluntary movements and our most advanced tricks, like thinking and learning and regulating and recognizing emotions and experiencing consciousness in general. You'll remember that higher processing requires lots of synapses, which require lots of nervous tissue, so as the cerebrum grew through evolutionary time, it got more massive, but our skull didn't exactly keep up. So in order to squeeze all that material into your skull, the brain forms little creases called gyri and larger grooves, or sulci, giving it more folds than an origami pineapple. And although a big fissure separates the left and right hemispheres, the two halves communicate through a series of myelinated axon fibers called the corpus callosum. And each hemisphere has other smaller fissures that divide it into lobes, each with a different set of major functions. The frontal lobe, for example, governs muscle control and cognitive functions like planning for the future, concentration, and preventing socially unacceptable behaviors. In most people, this area doesn't finish developing until after the teenage years, which tells you a lot about the teenage years. Since Broca's area lives in this lobe in the left hemisphere, it also is important in language comprehension and speech. If you're enjoying a beautiful sunset, you can thank your occipital lobe at the back of your head for processing those bright visual cues. And the next time you step on a Lego, you can curse your parietal lobe, which processes the sensations of touch, pain, and pressure. Meanwhile, the temporal lobe helps sort out auditory information, including language. It contains the larynx area, another important region of the brain associated with the production of written and spoken language. This part of the limbic system includes your short-term memory keeper, the hippocampus, and the emotional amygdala, which controls sexual and social behavior. So if you damage the wrong part of your temporal lobe, you may never again be able to remember what you ate for lunch, or you might suddenly become a total jerk who kicks kittens and cuts in line. We could do a whole course on the finer-grained functions and consequences of malfunction in every bit of brain in your gourd, but well, we can't do that today. And you gotta remember that when it comes to your body, no organ or system is an island. Your brain will be pretty useless if it weren't hooked up to the outside world. That's where the peripheral nervous system comes in, which we'll be spending the next few lessons exploring.
Okay, so there are a ton of terms in there, like normal in these crash course videos, but the vast majority of them you should at least hopefully recognize, and by Friday, hopefully know a lot more about, or at least remember a lot more about. But that's it for today, and I'll see you guys either in lab or see you on Wednesday.